The forest is awake. What time is it where you are? And from where do you listen? Subscribe and hear what hides in the dark. I decided on a whim to head out to San Felipe Road at around 3 in the morning, dragging a couple of friends along for the ride. We figured we'd drive until we got that creeped out thrill you only feel in the dark, when the world seems a little too quiet. The minute we turned onto that road, though, I knew we were in for something else entirely. It was like the temperature around us dipped the second we passed the final street lamp. Even the air tasted heavier. The fog showed up out of nowhere. One moment, we could see a good stretch of road. The next, we were practically crawling along, trying not to drive off into the trees. Our headlights cut through milky walls that made the whole place look like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The car fell silent as the driver eased up on the gas. I caught myself gripping the passenger door handle, pulse racing for reasons I couldn't quite pin down. After a few minutes, someone in the back asked if we were sure about this, which sent a ripple of second thoughts through me. But I kept telling myself we'd be fine. We weren't exactly ghost hunters, just a bunch of night owls looking for a little excitement. The emptiness of the road, though, had a weight to it that pressed on my thoughts. It felt like everything around us was watching, even though I couldn't spot a single living thing through the fog. Eventually, my eyes locked on a vague shape ahead, barely visible beyond the headlights. It was so faint I thought I might be seeing patches of mist swirling in a weird pattern. But the driver cursed under his breath. He spotted it too. He slowed to a near stop, trying to figure out what we were looking at. I leaned forward, squinting, my pulse hammering away. The outline was odd, kind of box-like, except the edges rippled, like they couldn't decide if they wanted to stay solid. My nerves flared, and everything in me wanted to tell him to hit the gas. Before I could speak, one of my friends in the back started yelling. They sounded scared out of their mind, pointing to something up in a massive tree. They kept insisting they could make out a heavy form with fur, some sort of claws scraping the bark. I swear, I only glimpsed a flicker of movement. It might have been a branch shifting in the wind, but the panic in my friend's voice said otherwise. The driver slammed down the accelerator, and we shot forward in a blind rush to get away. All the while, I was convinced we were about to crash. The fog seemed thicker now, as if the road wanted to keep us there. The engine roared, everyone was yelling at once, and fear rattled around inside my head. I glanced back, half expecting to see some monstrosity bounding after us, but it was just a blur of headlights on white mist. My chest felt like it was going to burst from the pressure of pure, raw panic. Somehow, we ended up on a clearer stretch, and the fog lifted. It was jarring, going from that suffocating blanket to an almost normal road. We all took a second to breathe, but the car was filled with this shared dread. Nobody knew what to say. Did we really see something? Or was it a trick of light and fog? One thing was certain. If we did see what we thought we did, we sure as hell wanted no part of it. It wasn't until we got even farther away that words came back to us. Everyone tried to talk at once, each describing a slightly different horror. The driver couldn't shake the image of that transparent, boxy thing near the base of the tree. The two in the back were still reeling over the creature they were convinced was clinging to the trunk. Personally, I didn't know what to think. All I knew was the road felt more hostile than any place I'd ever been, and I was ready to put as many miles between us and San Felipe as possible. When we finally came to a stop, safe on a wider stretch of highway, nobody could ignore how shaken we were. We stayed in the car with the doors locked, just sitting there, hearing our own breathing, trying to puzzle out how a stupid idea for a late-night drive turned into something that left us cold with fear. I don't remember who broke the silence, but they said exactly what I was already feeling. We're never going back there again. No one argued. After that harrowing night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep more than a couple of hours. Every time I shut my eyes, flashes of fog-shrouded roads and warped shapes hit me like a twisted reel on replay. It wasn't just me. Everyone in our group was rattled. We texted each other at weird times, sharing bits of restless frustration and half-baked theories about what we'd witnessed. Some suggested we'd seen a wild animal. Others swore it was something far beyond that. But as the hours slipped by, curiosity snuck up on us. Despite the knots in our stomachs, we agreed to head back. Yes, back. Just to confirm we weren't losing our minds. Part of me screamed that I should let it go, but a stronger part insisted on a second look. Maybe we needed proof we weren't collectively hallucinating. We waited until midnight, then drove in tense silence through familiar streets. The closer we got to San Felipe, the more my nerves wound tighter. The road was still and unnervingly clear tonight, all the fog gone like it had never existed. The driver slowed near the spot where everything went haywire before. Even though the headlights swept over the same towering tree, the branches looked different in the glare. No trace of that boxy phantom, no sign of the bulky clawed figure gripping the trunk. We pulled over to the side, hearts pounding, but kept the engine running, like we needed a safety net in case anything lunged out from the shadows. I stepped out, half expecting something to charge at us from the darkness. The air was crisp, almost too quiet. I circled the tree where we'd first glimpsed the nightmare, shining a flashlight up the trunk. I wanted to see if there were any scraps of fur, footprints, anything that could validate our story. The bark had a few deep scratches, but for all I knew, they could have been there for years. No weird footprints, no slime, no matted fur. Just our collective dread, and a big tree rustling in the light breeze. Standing there made me feel exposed, like eyes hidden among the branches were sizing me up. I kept spinning around, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Each brush of leaves against leaves made me jump. It was obvious I wasn't going to find any neat evidence, but I still lingered, as if a clue might materialize out of thin air. Eventually, we decided we'd seen enough. That's when the first wave of real paranoia sank in. Maybe we were being watched. The idea whispered through my head. Something could be crouched behind those trunks, silently observing. The only thing we heard, though, was our own unsteady breathing and the occasional shift of undergrowth. So we made a quick exit, feeling foolish that we'd even bothered to come back. Afterward, we drove aimlessly for a bit, trying to calm down. Nobody wanted to go home just yet, so we ended up in a deserted parking lot, all of us wired and rattled. We swapped stories we'd heard about San Felipe, tales of a solitary figure robed in black, weird shrieks echoing through the trees, monstrous silhouettes slinking past unsuspecting drivers. Some accounts sounded bizarre, but honestly, after what we'd seen, I was in no position to dismiss anything outright. Over the next few nights, the dread followed me like a shadow. Each time I shut off the lights in my room, I'd sense that thick fog creeping back into my thoughts. If a branch tapped against the window, I'd jolt upright, convinced something was trying to claw its way inside. My dreams were worse, nightmares where I'd be stuck on San Felipe alone, shining a flashlight onto a hollow-eyed creature perched on a tree. Sometimes it would crawl down toward me, and I'd wake up in a trembling panic, wishing I could forget every detail. The others described similar dreams, glimpses of that shapeless boxy thing hovering over them, or twisted figures prowling along the roadside. A friend claimed they heard footsteps outside their window late at night. Another said they saw fleeting movement in their peripheral vision whenever they thought about that drive. We wondered if any of it was real, or just our imaginations running wild. Either way, it was seeping into every corner of our lives. I tried to push it all aside and get back to some sense of normal. But each time I glanced at the map and saw how close my house was to that eerie stretch of road, a pit opened in my stomach. It gnawed at me that the weird sightings had happened practically in my backyard. Rumors started swirling about other people spotting things, or hearing wails that resembled a person's scream. Someone even mentioned hooded figures lurking by the trees at dawn. Every new story kept the anxiety alive. I'd tell myself I was done with that road, that I had no reason to risk it again. Yet deep down, part of me wanted another shot at understanding. What was it about that place? Why did the fog roll in there like a deliberate cloak one moment, then vanish without warning the next? And what was that squarish, translucent form, or that heavy, fur-covered shape in the tree? For now, though, none of us had the nerve to investigate further. We'd already learned our lesson. Whether it was some strange animal, a supernatural force, or pure collective hysteria, we didn't want to provoke it. Our nightmares were bad enough. So we kept to our lit-up streets, tried to fill our days with normal routines, and clung to the hope that whatever lurked out there in the darkness would stay far, far away from the safety of our homes. If it decided otherwise, I wasn't sure we'd be prepared to face it again. I should have known the night would be different the second Ben rolled up in that old sedan he'd borrowed from his brother. Usually we relied on battered skateboards or our own 2 feet for these late-night hangouts. But something about having a car at our disposal made everything feel way more daring. Ben's grin told me he was itching to push our usual boundaries, and Mark and Josh had that same spark in their eyes. We piled in, the seats creaking beneath us, and my nerves started buzzing the instant Ben turned the key. The headlights sliced through the darkness as we backed out of my driveway like we were on some secret mission. Nobody mentioned a destination. We just drove, letting the quiet roads guide us wherever they felt like leading. I remember trying to crack a few jokes, maybe poke fun at the squeaky belt in the engine, but my voice sounded strained. Deep down, I couldn't shake the anxiety that tonight held an edge I hadn't felt before. The highways were ghostly. The moon hid behind layers of thick clouds, and the few vehicles we passed seemed in a hurry to vanish. Even the passing signs, those that lit up under our headlights, felt somehow ominous, like they'd been left there decades ago and never replaced. Mark elbowed me in the back seat, muttering something about how cool it'd be if we found an abandoned playground or an old factory to explore. I tried to nod along, but the silence in the car seemed heavier than usual, wrapping around us every time we stopped talking. Eventually, Ben pointed at the fuel gauge with a curse. We were running low, so he said he'd pull off at the next station he saw. We found one, a grimy little place with a single humming fluorescent light. It looked half dead, like nobody had bothered to give it a fresh coat of paint in years. Still, it was our only option, so we tumbled out of the car, stretching stiff limbs and blinking against the flickering glow. I took a few steps away from the car to scope out the area. The night air tasted slightly stale, but there was also a dank, earthy smell lingering. That's when I noticed a sign at the edge of the lot. It was old, peeling, but I could just make out the words, "Forest Preserve Entrance," beneath a layer of moss. Right away, I had this creeping sense that we weren't meant to be here. Mark, on the other hand, was practically giddy. He kept nudging Ben and Josh, telling them we should check it out. Ben, eyes gleaming with mischief, went along without much prodding. Josh shrugged, half smiling, like he was up for anything as long as we didn't bail on him. I watched them gather near the broken fence that led into the preserve. My pulse hammered in my ears. I told them I wasn't so sure, that maybe we should stick to safer spots for once. But that didn't slow their enthusiasm. They insisted it'd be quick, just a peek, and that we'd find a trail cutting straight through to another gas station on the opposite side. I wish I could say I found a solid excuse, some ironclad reason to keep us out of those trees. But I only muttered a half-hearted protest before following them back to the car. My footsteps felt like lead, and that heaviness in the air was stronger the closer we got to the tree line. The headlights briefly lit up the first few trunks, revealing tangles of branches overhead. The shapes twisted in a way that made my stomach knot. I couldn't bring myself to enter that path, and I finally admitted it out loud. "Look, I'll meet you all on the other side," I said, trying not to sound terrified. The plan, if you could call it that, was for them to cut straight through the preserve while I walked around on the main roads. They teased me, called me the cautious one, but I could tell none of us was really laughing. Something about those woods seemed off, even to them. So I watched them disappear into that blackness, 3 moving silhouettes swallowed by the trees. That was the moment when I felt sure we'd crossed some unspoken boundary. My heart was thumping, but I forced myself to turn away, determined to stick to the roads. As I set off, the wind picked up, rustling leaves somewhere behind me. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Either way, I started walking faster. I had no clue then just how bad things would get. or the sight that would greet me at that next gas station. All I knew was that I didn't trust those woods, and even with the uneasy feeling trailing me, it felt safer on the open road. Looking back, I guess that small spark of caution might have saved me from whatever lurked in those trees. But it also left me alone, pacing empty streets in the pitch black, with nothing to distract me from the endless possibilities my mind kept conjuring. I kept reminding myself it was only a 30-minute walk around the perimeter, but it might as well have been hours. The roads were eerily quiet. No headlights passing by, no distant hum of late-night traffic, just the soft crunch of my shoes against the gravel shoulder and my imagination going wild. Every so often I'd glance back, half expecting to see the others trailing behind me, but no one emerged from that dark tree line. The gas station finally came into view, a lone beacon of fluorescent glow in the distance. My relief was short-lived, though. As soon as I stepped onto the cracked asphalt, that weird tension in the air hit me like a wave. I peered through the glass door, searching for any sign of my friends. The bored clerk at the register glanced up, gave me a nod, then went back to his magazine. Apparently 3 frantic teenagers had not come flying through the door. I lingered by the cold beverage coolers, trying to look casual. 10 minutes ticked by. 10 ridiculously long minutes. Mark, Josh, and Ben were nowhere to be found. I started to wonder if they'd decided to bail and head back to the car. Or worse, maybe something had happened inside those woods. I was trying to tamp down my anxiety with logical explanations, but it was no good. Each passing moment tightened the knot in my stomach. The door jingled behind me, but it was just an older woman buying a late-night snack. I asked the clerk if he'd noticed 3 teenage guys wandering in, and he gave me a flat-out no. My nerves were about to boil over. One part of me considered charging straight back into the forest. Another part insisted I'd be insane to do that alone. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps clattering on the concrete outside. I spun around just as Mark, Josh, and Ben tore around the corner of the building. They looked wrecked, drenched in sweat, faces pale, eyes darting everywhere. I rushed to meet them, feeling a weird mix of relief and terror. If they were safe enough to run, that meant they were alive. But their expression said they'd come far too close to something. We tumbled into the gas station's tiny seating area. The harsh lighting made them look even more rattled. Nobody could talk for the first few seconds. They were panting and leaning over the small plastic table like they'd just sprinted a marathon. What happened? I finally managed to get out, barely above a whisper. Ben tried to speak but ended up shaking his head as if words weren't enough. Mark took a shaky breath, then started explaining. Halfway through the path, they noticed weird noises behind them, like crunching leaves and snapping twigs. At first, they thought maybe it was a deer, but it grew heavier, more deliberate. Then they spotted it, a tall, pale figure among the trees. The shape was vaguely human but bulkier and unnaturally long-limbed, with burning red eyes that seemed locked onto them. My mind went blank for a second. I'd heard plenty of ghost stories from the guys before, but none of them had ever looked this spooked. Josh added his piece, describing the sounds of branches cracking like something big was pushing through at high speed, pursuing them. The moment they glimpsed those eyes, logic went out the window. They just bolted, not caring what they tripped over or how loud they screamed. I pictured them crashing through the undergrowth, chased by something they couldn't explain. The thought made my skin crawl. They said when they finally reached the edge of the forest, they could sense that presence still behind them, breathing, thrashing through leaves, until they burst out onto the road. That was the first time they felt it hesitate. Mark said he looked back and caught one final glimpse. The thing stood at the edge of the trees, unmoving, like it was testing whether to follow. Then, with no warning, it just sort of vanished back into the darkness. I asked if maybe they were messing with me, but their expressions didn't waver. Josh had tears in his eyes he was trying to hide, and Ben looked on the verge of hyperventilating. They were beyond done with the night's adventure. And honestly, so was I. The 4 of us decided we'd had enough. We scrambled outside and huddled together, scanning the tree line across the street. My imagination made every shifting shadow look like that pale shape was about to burst out again. I swear, none of us even blinked for a good minute. We must have looked like a bunch of cornered animals. Finally, I managed to break the spell, urging us to get back to the sedan. Our nerves practically screamed at us to run, so we did. The journey down the road to the car felt like sprinting a gauntlet, each step fueled by a desperation to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had prowled those woods. When we reached the vehicle, Ben fumbled with the keys for a good few seconds before getting the door unlocked. My heart hammered so loudly, I was sure everyone else could hear it. We piled in and slammed the doors, as if that ancient metal frame could protect us from all the horrors out there. No one said anything for the first mile or two of the drive home. We just stared at the passing scenery, deserted sidewalks, empty fields, the occasional flickering streetlight. Every dark corner felt like it might be hiding that same entity we'd left behind. By the time we finally saw the faint outlines of our own neighborhood, the sky was starting to lighten. Not enough to wash away our fear, though. I'd never been so happy to see my own driveway. We sat there for a second, engine ticking, exhausted beyond words. Gradually we mumbled quick goodbyes and stumbled out, each of us craving the safety of our rooms. That night, or what was left of it, barely let me rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that looming shape. I replayed my friends' frantic breaths and trembling voices. We'd always thought we were unstoppable, just a bunch of teens chasing the thrill of exploring creepy spots. But this was different, and we all felt it. Something was out there, beyond any rumor or urban legend we'd joked about before. And after experiencing that kind of terror firsthand, we knew our late-night adventures had changed forever. I'd been driving for what felt like ages, chasing the horizon in a half-awake state. The clock on the dash kept taunting me with 3:48 a.m., then 3:49, like each minute was dragging itself across my nerves. The highway stretched on in a straight line, dark and empty, and the cold managed to seep through every crack in my old Dodge. There were moments when I thought about just pulling over and sleeping for a couple of hours, but the fuel gauge needle dipped closer to empty every time I glanced at it, so I pushed on. When I finally spotted lights, my first reaction was sheer relief, until I actually got close enough to see what I was dealing with. It wasn't a bustling rest stop, or even a brightly lit convenience store. Instead, a single flickering street lamp revealed a tiny gas station that looked like it belonged in another decade. The paint had chipped off the walls. The windows on the adjacent shops were either boarded up or covered with a layer of grime, so thick you couldn't see inside. It reminded me of one of those sets they use for low-budget horror flicks. Perfectly quiet, perfectly still, and way too inviting for trouble. I stepped out of my truck, and the biting air made me wince. My breath hung in front of my face for a split second before drifting off. The silence around me was so thick that every movement felt magnified. The pump made a dull hum as I slid my card and tried not to think about how dark everything was. Beyond that single pool of light, not a single car passed on the road behind me. The whole place seemed deserted, like I'd wandered into a forgotten world. Then I saw it. The outline of a sleek black lowrider at the back of the building, almost swallowed by shadows. I hadn't noticed it at first, probably because the car's tinted windows and midnight paint job seemed tailor-made for blending into the gloom. Standing around it were 4 guys who looked like they belonged anywhere but this freezing ghost town. Tattoos stretched across their arms, covering most of their exposed skin. They wore shorts, tank tops, and high socks, acting like the temperature didn't matter. The quiet grew even heavier as I realized they weren't chatting or moving around. They were just leaning there, watching me fill the tank. My heart felt like it wanted to leap straight up my throat, but I tried to keep calm, focusing on the pump like it was the most fascinating thing in the universe. The neon bulb above me buzzed and flickered, occasionally bathing them in a sudden light that made their tattoos shine. I wasn't sure if they'd been waiting for me to notice them, or if this was just chance. But the moment felt loaded with tension. Their eyes, though I could barely see them in that half-light, seemed to lock on me, and I didn't sense any hint of friendliness. They started moving my way in unison, slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. This was when I realized how alone I truly was. No cashier behind the counter. No late-night travelers rolling in with headlights, slicing through the dark. Just me, my sputtering truck, and a half-lit station in the middle of nowhere. My brain kicked into overdrive. Should I try to greet them politely? Pretend everything was normal? Or just get the hell out of there? I decided to trust my gut. I yanked the nozzle free, spilling some gas in my rush, and practically dove into my truck. The engine hesitated for a split second before roaring to life. In the rearview mirror, I caught sight of them, stepping closer, their silhouettes looming larger. The overhead lamp flickered a few times, throwing their shapes in and out of view. It was unsettling enough that I didn't even consider sticking around to see what they wanted. Gripping the wheel, I slammed the accelerator to the floor. The tires spun briefly on the cold pavement before the truck surged forward. As I pulled out onto the road, I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder. They were still there, just a few steps away from where I'd been, and I thought I caught a gleam in one of their gazes, under the dying fluorescent light. My breath rattled in my chest as I sped away, the station shrinking in the mirrors. Part of me felt stupid for reacting like that. Maybe they were just harmless locals, but something about that silent approach, and those intense stares, convinced me otherwise. The entire town, or what passed for one, seemed to vanish behind me, and I told myself I wouldn't stop again until I hit a place brimming with neon lights and other people. Little did I know, my heartbeat was about to spike all over again, because the road behind me wouldn't stay empty for long. I'd barely cleared that rickety gas station when I caught headlights in the rearview mirror, a telltale sweep of harsh white cutting across the road. The rational part of me hoped it was a coincidence, that maybe these guys were just heading in the same direction, out for a spin at an hour that made zero sense to normal people. But this definitely didn't feel normal. My hand started to shake on the steering wheel, and every nerve in my body went on high alert as those lights grew stronger, closing the gap in seconds. My old Dodge rattled as I floored it, the engine growling like it was ready for a fight. The cold air blasting through the cracked windows whipped around me, and the tires screeched in protest when I veered onto the main highway. In the mirrors, the lowrider's shape cut through the darkness, a sleek predator hungry for a chase. They stuck to my tail for the first half-mile, headlights flickering against the battered tailgate of my truck. I kept praying to see any sign of other cars, or some night shift folks commuting somewhere. But the highway was as empty as a tomb, just a lone set of bright beams bearing down on me. The truck shuddered again, but it held on, which was a small miracle. I figured they assumed I was driving an underpowered rust bucket that would fold under pressure. Poor assumption on their part. My heart pounded so hard that my breath kept catching in my throat. The engine roared as we tore along the open road, and I leaned forward, silently begging my truck for more speed. Some part of me relished how unsuspecting my old ride seemed. On the outside, it was all peeling paint and squeaky belts, but beneath that hood, I'd put in a performance-tuned Hemi. I never imagined I'd actually be relying on that secret weapon to outrun a group of shady characters in the dead of night. But here we were. They tried to keep up, pushing that lowrider for everything it had. I saw them drawing closer in short bursts, as though maybe they'd catch a draft or find a sweet spot behind me. But each time, I'd press down even harder on the gas. The truck kept responding, a deep rumble matching the adrenaline flooding my veins. The lonely strip of asphalt blurred under my headlights. Mile markers whipping past so fast I could hardly read them. Eventually, the distance started to stretch. Those headlights fell behind, drifting into smaller and smaller specks. My heartbeat was still slamming, and I half expected them to pull off some trick, zigzagging onto a back road to cut me off. Or maybe they'd radio for backup. My imagination ran wild, conjuring up every worst-case scenario. But after a few more frantic minutes, their lights diminished into the blackness, and I was left with only the pounding of my pulse and the quiet hum of the highway. I didn't let up on the gas for a long while. Every time I told myself they'd given up, a sliver of doubt prodded me to keep racing forward. By the time I finally eased off, the engine let out a weary cough, like it was just as tense as I was. I pulled over for a second, blinking into the rear view, to be absolutely sure nothing was lurking back there. Darkness. No headlights. No sign of that lowrider. A shaky laugh tumbled out of me. It sounded a little unhinged, even to my own ears. Maybe this was the part where I was supposed to celebrate outrunning them, but I felt more uneasy than triumphant. Whatever those guys were up to, I wanted no part of it. No telling what could have gone down if they'd cornered me on a lonely stretch of highway, especially if they were more than just rowdy locals. The thought of it made my stomach twist. I didn't share the story with anyone until I got to a bigger town that morning. After finding a place that served coffee, something cheap and scalding, I started spilling the details to a friend of mine, who happened to be a local cop. He listened, hardly blinking, and by the time I reached the part about the lowrider roaring out from the station, his expression said it all. He told me that route had a rep for cartel runs avoiding the main interstate patrols. He said it so calmly, like someone just talking about how the weather might turn tomorrow. I felt my skin prickle as everything clicked into place. Those tattoos, that silent confidence. I realized my run-in might have been more than just a bad luck encounter with local tough guys. Maybe they wanted my truck. Maybe they thought I was an easy target. Who knows? He shrugged and said I was lucky. One of those times you outrun trouble before it drags you into a place you can't escape from. Lucky? Sure. But the relief I felt was tied up with a heavy dose of dread, because I knew I'd walked a razor's edge without even realizing it. The memory of that flickering light at the gas station, and those blank, watchful faces, was still burned into my mind, and it made my teeth clench every time I thought about how quiet they'd been. And that's basically where I left things. I drove on, praying I'd never see another ghost town station again. If I do, I'm rolling right past it, no matter how low my fuel gauge might be. Some lessons come wrapped in fear, and this one taught me that in the middle of nowhere, anything can happen. And it usually does when you're least prepared. I woke up that morning with a weird mixture of excitement and nerves, thinking the trip to Dahile and Bukidnon Park would be smooth sailing. My cousins and I were crammed into the back of my uncle's big SUV, giggling over who'd get the window seat. We had snacks, music, and all the naive optimism in the world. If I'd known what was coming, I probably would have stayed in bed. The GPS was the first problem, though I didn't see it at the time. We were so sure this fancy app would guide us perfectly. My uncle, who's usually a careful driver, put all his faith in that digital voice telling us where to turn. The day started bright, the sky so blue it almost hurt my eyes when I glanced out the window. Everything seemed perfect, at least until we left the familiar main highway. We ended up on a narrower road that slithered through some thick trees. At first, it felt like an adventure, like we were discovering a hidden gem. My mom, perched in the front seat, leaned forward, double-checking the map on her phone. She mumbled something in Cebuano under her breath, and I caught the serious look in her eyes. She started asking my uncle to slow down, repeating it in a tighter voice. The sunlight kept slipping lower and lower, and a dull orange glow tinted everything around us. It created this weird sense that time was running out, like we needed to find our way before darkness took over. The SUV's wheels crunched on gravel, as the path beneath us grew even more precarious. One side was a tumble of rocky drop-offs. The other side looked like a barricade of looming trunks. My stomach knotted every time the car swayed a bit too close to the edge. Eventually my head got heavy from the tension, and I started drifting off in my seat. I tried to keep my eyes shut, hoping it would calm me down. Suddenly my mom's voice got sharper, telling my uncle, again, to be careful. I peered outside and realized the road had become ridiculously thin. It felt like we were driving on a ribbon of land suspended over some dark pit I couldn't see, and I forced myself to breathe slowly. My cousins, who'd been laughing just an hour earlier, were dead quiet. One of them clutched the seat in front of him, as if that could keep us from veering off the edge. The tension in the SUV was almost suffocating. My eyes darted around, noticing how the trees kept pressing in, almost as if they didn't want us there. When my uncle tried to crack a joke, something about how adventurous we were, I didn't even fake a laugh. I just wanted this part of the drive to be over. We crawled forward inch by inch. The car's headlights started to make everything look more sinister than it should, illuminating random branches that stretched out like thin arms. The sunset had nearly vanished, so our own lights were the only thing guiding us. My mom's voice grew louder each time the SUV jolted, and my uncle's knuckles turned white around the steering wheel. Then, up ahead, I saw a slightly wider patch of dirt, a spot where we could maybe turn around. Relief fluttered through me, but I was still on edge. My uncle inched the vehicle forward, tires kicking small rocks into the darkness below. This was the moment we'd all been holding our breath for. Could we actually make that turn without tipping? The entire car seemed to shift as my uncle eased the steering wheel, backing up and turning in tiny increments. My heart hammered so loudly that I was sure the others could hear it too. I watched the side mirror nearly scrape against a protruding rock wall. At the same time, the other side of the SUV felt like it was hovering over emptiness. But my uncle kept going, focusing on my mom's guidance as she checked the wheel clearance. When we finally completed that three-point turn, the car's nose pointed downhill again, and I realized I was practically shaking from the tension. My mom let out a wavering sigh, and my cousins exhaled all at once. Even my uncle, who tried to stay calm, showed this nervous grin that told me he was just as relieved as the rest of us. I looked outside. The same path that felt impossible just moments ago suddenly seemed like the only safe direction we had. We started heading back toward what we hoped was a main road. My uncle sped up ever so slightly, and I felt a flicker of hope that the worst part was behind us. My mom kept watch at the window, still whispering that we'd made the right choice by turning around. I remember thinking nothing could top the terror of that narrow road, and that we'd never again trust a phone app with our lives. But a tiny voice in my head warned me we weren't off the hook yet. The sky was darkening rapidly, and we still had hours of driving ahead. Hours I had a feeling would test our nerves in ways we weren't prepared for. And so, with that tense U-turn behind us, we pressed on. My family tried to act normal, but the rattled energy in the car clung to us like a static charge. I stared through the window, hoping for city lights or any sign of civilization, while the last streaks of daylight vanished. We all silently wondered if our excursion would lead to something better, or if we'd stumble into something even more unsettling just around the bend. We'd been on the road longer than planned, but my uncle seemed determined to find another way to Dahale and Bukidnon Park. The day's earlier scare still lingered in my mind, making every minute feel heavier. The GPS had lost our trust, so he relied on a faint memory of backroads he was sure he'd taken years ago. There were no streetlights out here, just the glow of our headlights sweeping across endless rows of looming trunks. The night felt darker than usual, like a thick curtain we couldn't push aside. I tried to look out the windows, but there was nothing but the reflection of our own anxious faces. My mom huddled up front, murmuring that maybe we'd be better off pulling over and waiting until daylight. My uncle insisted we keep going, convinced the main road was just a bit further. As we pressed on, the path turned rough. Loose gravel rattled under the tires. With every bump, a wave of tension rippled through everyone in the SUV. The interior light was off, but even in the dim glow from the dash, I could see worry etched on my cousins' faces. They clutched their seats, as though bracing themselves for another unexpected drop-off. Meanwhile, I could barely ignore the unsettled feeling in my gut, a warning sign I couldn't shrug away. Then the SUV rolled to a halt. The headlights revealed the road simply ended, as though some giant hand had torn it away. My uncle killed the engine for a moment, muttering about how something wasn't right. Outside, the dark stretched out on all sides. The silence was so absolute I could almost hear my own pulse. My mom coaxed him into stepping out to see if maybe there was a hidden turn, or a gap we hadn't noticed. When he opened the door, a blast of cold air whipped inside. It smelled earthy, damp, almost like the area wanted to swallow us whole. I leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse from where I sat, but my uncle had disappeared into the blackness. All of us stayed quiet, waiting, until his figure flickered back into the headlights. By his expression, I knew there was nothing else out there, no quick path to salvation. He climbed back in, locked the door, and flicked on the high beams. That's when I noticed a row of silhouettes, people clustered just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. But no, there were multiple figures standing too still. My mom whispered under her breath, asking who they could be. No one had an answer. The strangers didn't wave us down, didn't call for help. They just remained there, which was somehow more unsettling than if they'd shouted or approached. My uncle hesitated, like he was debating whether to call out or flash the horn. My heart hammered so hard I could barely focus. The 2 or 3 seconds he spent in that indecision felt like an eternity. Finally, he slid the SUV into reverse, and I felt that creeping worry intensify. Those people didn't move as our headlights panned away. If they were travelers, they would have done something, asked for assistance or signaled a warning. Instead, they just observed us. My body felt drained, the day's stress catching up to me. I must have dozed off for a bit in sheer exhaustion. Next thing I knew, the rumble of the engine had changed tone. We were on paved road again. Lights gleamed in the distance. Actual city lights, the kind I never thought I'd be so relieved to see. My mother pointed out a 7-Eleven, and my uncle quickly pulled in. Just like that, it felt like we'd rejoined reality. Climbing out of the SUV, I noticed my legs were shaky. The store's neon sign lit up the parking lot in an artificial glow. We piled inside for warm food and something to drink. My cousins seemed to snap out of their daze. They grabbed hot dogs, chips, anything to fill the gnawing hunger. My mom looked around like she could hardly believe we were safe. Eating never felt so comforting. Yet every bite reminded me of that uneasy darkness and the silent group we left behind. My uncle muttered that he'd never trust that old route again, and I was ready to agree with him 1,000%. Part of me needed a moment to catch my breath and really process the fact that we'd escaped. But a deeper worry wouldn't let go. What if we'd stayed just a minute longer? Would those people have approached us? Would we have gone missing without a trace? Even though the worst had passed, the images wouldn't leave my mind. Sometimes the most terrifying experiences aren't the near accidents on a narrow road. They're the ones you can't logically explain. Those watchers in the shadows, the question of why they were out there in the middle of nowhere, gave me more sleepless nights than the thought of tumbling off a cliff. The hum of the 7-Eleven's cooling system and the fluorescent lights offered a false sense of security. My mom patted my shoulder, asking if I was okay. I nodded, my eyes drifting toward the darkness outside, half expecting to see those figures again. We'd found our way back onto the main road this time, but a little piece of me stayed behind in that forest, haunted by the unknown. If I learned anything, it's that not every road on a map is meant to be traveled, not by us, anyway. We'd stumbled onto something beyond our understanding, and maybe we'd done the smart thing by leaving quickly. Some nights, though, I wonder if I'd prefer having a good explanation over that eerie silence that clings to me still. I woke up before dawn, throwing my bag into the back seat of my dusty sedan and waving to my wife, who was still half asleep on the porch. We always exchange a few words before I head out, though neither of us expects anything thrilling to happen during that long trek across the Mojave. Once I got on the road, I dialed her up again, just to keep myself company, and settled into the drive, resigned to the endless sea of cracked earth and faded highway stripes. The sun rose in slow increments, turning the skyline a hazy orange. Everything outside the window felt stubbornly still, like the desert itself was listening. My wife's voice drifted in and out, the signal wavering as I passed through spots where the terrain dipped. Truth be told, I was less focused on our conversation than on the shimmering blacktop stretching out in front of me. A faint sense of nerves gnawed at me, and I couldn't figure out why. It was just a standard day, a regular commute. But something about that morning felt off, like the land was warning me to stay on high alert. After an hour or so, a motorcycle appeared in the distance. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, a lone rider hugging the road, weaving expertly past tumbleweeds and sand drifts. I remember thinking he looked too calm, too assured. The speed limit out here is already high, but he was pushing it even further, easily bouncing between 70 and 90. My wife asked if everything was okay, probably sensing my distracted tone, and I said something vague about traffic. As I continued, I couldn't stop watching him. There's a certain unpredictability to these desert highways. A sudden bend can appear right after a deceptively straight mile. Signs mark sharp curves at 45 miles per hour, but folks often ignore them. Still, seeing him approach a particularly nasty turn at such a breakneck pace made my stomach twist. I told my wife to hold on a second. My eyes locked on the motorcycle. The rider either didn't notice the sign or didn't care. He didn't lean. He didn't slow. In a blur, he flew off the road's edge. One moment he was there. The next, he'd vanished, swallowed by the drop-off beyond the guardrail. A harsh burst of panic seized me, and I uttered some kind of startled grunt into the phone. My wife's voice spiked with alarm, but I could barely speak. My mind ran wild, picturing twisted metal, a figure sprawled in the desert scrub. I forced myself to end the call, God knows what I sounded like, and jerked the wheel to pull onto the shoulder. The tires crunched over loose gravel. Everything felt unreal. The sun was glaring in my eyes, my phone already in hand, dialing 911 without me really thinking about it. That was the moment I realized I might have just witnessed something no one would ever want to see. Over the dispatcher's voice, I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven. With my kit under one arm, I stepped out into the desert heat, my legs feeling strange, like they wanted to lock up. That's when I peered over the side, bracing for something horrific, and knowing that no matter what I found, I wouldn't be the same afterward. I think I nearly dropped my phone as I scrambled down that slope, the 911 dispatcher's voice echoing faintly in the background. My hands shook despite the punishing desert heat, and each step sent loose gravel skidding beneath my boots. Part of me expected to find the rider instantly, sprawled out in a motionless heap, but the embankment was sharper than it looked from the road. It felt like descending into some hidden canyon where anything could be waiting. The dispatcher was still on the line. I stammered details about the crash, motorcycle going way too fast, took the curve straight on, that kind of thing. The dryness of the air clung to the back of my throat, making it harder to speak. By the time I reached the bottom, I realized just how far the rider must have flown after careening off that asphalt. Any sane calculation told me I'd find a tragedy. When I stepped around a boulder, I braced for the worst. Instead, I spotted movement, somebody actually on their feet. For a second I froze. Was I imagining this? The shape of a young man, maybe mid-20s, stumbling forward like he was trying to walk off a bad fall. Dust clung to his clothes, bits of sagebrush caught on him. His helmet dangled from one hand, cracked near the visor, and he looked so rattled he might topple over any second. "Hold on, buddy. Stay still," I called, my voice shaking. The dispatcher's questions blurred, and I fumbled my phone into my pocket, trusting them to pick up what they could through the rustle of my kit. I jogged over, heart hammering, half convinced he'd collapse under his own weight. Up close, the kid was covered in scrapes. He had a cut on his forehead that left a thin trail of blood across his face. His collarbone was obviously messed up, jutting slightly where it shouldn't. Somehow, he was still moving, though every step must have felt like fire. I told him not to push it, let me check him over. My gloved hands ran through a quick trauma assessment. No immediate gushing blood. Breathing rapid but functional. He mumbled something about losing control, his eyes darting around like he was afraid the ground might open up beneath him again. I glanced back at the mangled remains of the bike. It was destroyed. The front wheel bent at a 90-degree angle, torn metal scattered like shrapnel. The fact he'd survived being thrown that far was flat out miraculous. I remember thinking that if he could survive something like this, maybe I needed to trust the desert a little more, or respect it a lot more. Either way, I tried to keep him conscious while the dispatcher repeated instructions about waiting for an ambulance. Within minutes I heard sirens keening over the hum of the wind. I helped guide the rider to a safer patch of ground, careful not to jostle his shoulder. Dust clouded the air as the paramedics arrived, kicking up grit that stung my eyes. They hurried over, expressions shifting from urgent focus to outright astonishment when they saw him not only alive, but standing. They slid a brace around his neck, strapped him to a stretcher, and carried him up toward the waiting ambulance. I shadowed them, adrenaline still pumping, replaying the moment he'd soared off the curve. I told the EMTs everything, his speed, how he didn't even try to turn. They nodded, probably used to people overestimating what they can handle on these desert roads. One of them looked at me and said, "He's lucky you were right behind him." But luck didn't begin to describe what I felt. Relief, definitely, but also a lingering dread. Like I'd wandered into a story with an ending I could never have predicted. When the ambulance finally pulled away, sirens fading, the hush of the Mojave slipped back over me. I stood there, scanning the scattered debris, trying to come to grips with what had just happened. My sedan waited up on the road, looking oddly insignificant against the dunes and scrub. The entire scene felt like a glimpse into how fast life can flip on you. 1 minute, you're cruising in the desert, watching another driver. The next, you're staring at a near corpse who somehow held on to life. I trudged back up the slope, feeling drained, each footstep sending tiny rocks clattering behind me. By the time I reached my car, my phone was buzzing again. My wife calling, frantic about why I'd vanished mid-sentence. I answered, my voice raw. There was nothing supernatural about what I'd seen, yet it rattled me more than any ghost story ever could. All I could think about was how close that rider had come to tragedy. How quickly something ordinary had turned into a nightmare, and how, even with him safe in an ambulance, the desert seemed to watch me like it still had another trick up its sleeve. I climbed behind the wheel, took a few seconds to steady my breathing, and turned the key. The engine's rumble felt too normal after everything. Pulling back onto the highway, I told my wife I'd explain everything once I got a better grip on it myself. The road looked strangely different now, less predictable, more ominous. Every curve felt like it might hide another disaster waiting to happen. I tightened my hands around the steering wheel, determined to stay alert. Nothing around me had changed, but I certainly had. And somehow, I suspected I'd never view that lonely desert stretch the same way again. I've driven this route through Tennessee more times than I can count, but somehow, everything about it felt hostile that evening. My husband was dozing in the passenger seat, and that left me alone with the darkness outside, the rhythmic slap of wiper blades, and the never-ending twists in the road. Rain misted the windshield, and the fog gathered in dense patches that forced me to lean forward, like it would help me see through the murk. Something about the night made my nerves feel exposed. It wasn't just the weather, though that was bad enough with winding lanes and slick pavement. It was a kind of heavy quiet in the air. No other cars seemed willing to brave that stretch of road. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I was half hoping to spot headlights, just so I'd know we weren't the only ones out there. but it was all emptiness behind me. Every few miles, the fog would open up, and the headlights would reveal a glimpse of towering trees leaning in on either side, forming a tunnel of branches and dripping leaves. The occasional sign, wet and reflective, reminded me we were still on a state highway. Otherwise, I could have sworn we'd drifted off into some deserted back road with no clear end. The rhythmic static on the radio did little to settle my nerves. Each pop or hiss felt like a whisper suggesting something was lurking just beyond my field of vision. I tried not to wake my husband. He'd been exhausted, and there was no sense in both of us suffering through that drive. Still, part of me wanted to give him a gentle nudge, say, "Hey, something about this place is wrong," just so I wouldn't feel so alone. But I kept quiet. Instead, I stayed glued to the road, breathing in shallow bursts every time I rounded another tight curve. Around one particularly narrow bend, the trees were almost uncomfortably close. My headlights only illuminated a few feet ahead, leaving everything else swallowed by gloom. Then, off to the left, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Maybe 20 feet away, something massive peeled away from the tree line. At first, my brain refused to register what I was seeing. It was as if an entire trunk had stepped free from the rest of the forest. A jolt of unease shot through me, and I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe the fog was playing tricks with shadows. Maybe a snagged branch moved in the wind. But it was huge, taller than any living thing has a right to be, and it seemed to vanish back into the darkness in one smooth motion. One moment, there was this towering shape. The next, nothing. I wanted to slam on the brakes and get a better look, but I was afraid the car might skid on the wet asphalt. Besides, I couldn't risk stopping in such an isolated spot, with no shoulder to pull onto, and no visibility behind me. For a few seconds, I seriously questioned my own eyes. A detached part of me was yelling, it was just the fog, while another part insisted I'd just witnessed something that didn't belong in any nature guide. My breath came quicker as I pressed the accelerator, motivated by a primal instinct that shouted, "Get away." Each second dragged until the next clearing appeared, where I spotted a lonely, flickering motel sign in the distance. It seemed like a tiny beacon of safety, a reminder that civilization still existed. I exhaled a bit, thinking maybe I'd just let my mind wander. The gloom could have twisted a perfectly ordinary tree trunk into something monstrous. Right? Then the pang of doubt came roaring back. I'd seen it move. It didn't sway like branches in the wind. It slinked back the way a tall person might step behind a wall. Only, this was the height of a 3-story building, maybe taller. No way, that was normal. I thought about stopping at that motel, but it looked deserted. Just a handful of rooms with the lights off. It didn't feel any safer than the open road, so I kept going. My husband stirred in his seat, mumbled something about the rain, and drifted back to half sleep. I envied him for a second. I'd give anything not to be so keyed up right now. We pressed on, the road curving again under a canopy of dripping leaves. My eyes kept darting to the side, expecting another glimpse of that shape. Each time the wind rustled the branches, my pulse picked up, but the trees refused to reveal any more secrets. I was tempted to rifle through the radio channels again, just for some human voices, but I realized my hands were shaking, and I didn't want to lose focus on the wheel. Eventually, we came upon a slightly wider stretch, and there was a rundown diner, with all its lights off. It was just as desolate as the motel, but the parking lot offered a place to pull over. I did, briefly, to calm my nerves. My husband blinked awake, asked if everything was all right. I wanted to tell him everything, but the words refused to come. I just stared at the dripping overhang above the diner's door, half expecting that giant figure to emerge from behind the building. We didn't stay long. Soon, I was back on the road, forcing myself to concentrate on the dark pavement ahead. I glanced at the clock and realized how little distance we'd covered in what felt like an eternity. Every minute felt stretched and distorted, as if time was slowed down by the anxiety gnawing at me. As the highway wound deeper into darkness, I kept looking into the mirror, certain I'd catch a glimpse of that towering shape following us, only to see fog and empty road. In the passenger seat, my husband stirred again, concerned by my quiet tension, but I just told him I was fine. No point in scaring him until I had my own mind sorted out. Soon enough, the road straightened, and the forest retreated into the background. The uneasy weight on my chest eased, though it never vanished completely. I spent the remaining miles mentally replaying what I saw back there, my thoughts racing. Had I really seen a tree move? A cryptid? Was it just a trick of shadows? But each time I recalled how it vanished, I shuddered. The memory refused to feel like a simple illusion. We finally passed a sign announcing we were close to the state line. I breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Maybe once we made it into Kentucky, the night would lose its menace, and I could chalk the whole thing up to a creepy, roadside hallucination. But something in my gut insisted the memory would linger, long after the fog lifted, and as we drove on, I stole one last glance behind us, half convinced that shape was still out there, concealed in the dark, watching me leave. I pulled into the truck stop around midnight, drawn to its flickering neon sign like a castaway spotting land. Fat droplets of rain tapped against the roof as I parked beneath a weak street lamp. Even in that dim light, the place looked worn down. Faded paint, old vending machines humming in the corner, and a few greasy puddles on the asphalt. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, just letting the engine idle. My husband, now fully awake, looked over at me with worry, no doubt sensing the tension radiating off me. I still hadn't told him about what I witnessed earlier, and part of me didn't know how. It sounded insane, even in my own head. Despite my reluctance, we climbed out. We needed a break from that winding road. The air smelled like diesel and damp concrete. The light above the pumps flickered and buzzed every few seconds, making shadows shrink and grow across the parking lot. That steady pulse kept me on edge. I couldn't stop imagining that giant shape from earlier, lurking just beyond the glow. Inside the cramped convenience store, I grabbed a coffee while my husband wandered off to stretch his legs. I opened a search on my phone, half embarrassed to type keywords like massive tree creature, Tennessee cryptid, anything that might explain what I'd seen. Nothing relevant popped up. Just a scattering of myths and rumors about odd shapes in the woods. Local ghost stories, or sightings that never went anywhere. The lack of answers made me feel more alone than ever. We stepped back out into the damp night, and my husband started filling the tank. The single attendant on duty, an older man, approached with a polite nod. When I blurted something about the road being eerily empty, he just shrugged. His eyes flicked toward the dark highway like he knew more than he was letting on. "We get travelers coming through," he muttered. "Some swear they see things this time of year." Then he clammed up, almost like he regretted saying anything at all. I wanted to press him for details, but I couldn't shake the sense that he'd just shut down. My husband looked at me with concern, probably wondering why I was so rattled. I offered a tight smile, hoping he'd chalk it up to exhaustion. Truth was, my mind was spinning with thoughts of that impossible sight. The longer we stood there, the more I felt the darkness pressing in on all sides, as if something huge and watchful hovered right outside the circle of light. We got back into the car and pulled away from the truck stop, leaving that wavering neon sign in the rear view. The fog welcomed us again, thicker than before, swallowing the road so thoroughly I had to keep the speed way down. The headlights carved out a weak tunnel of visibility, and every shape beyond that felt ominous, like it might flicker to life at any second. Not 20 minutes later, the highway curved sharply through another stretch of dense forest. My husband finally spoke up, asking why I seemed so paranoid. I was about to give him a half-truth, blame it on the weather, when a tall, warped silhouette emerged by the edge of the tree line. It vanished almost immediately, but I caught a glimpse of something that didn't fit any known animal. Long, sinewy limb-like shapes, rustling the branches as if brushing them aside. My husband glanced out his window, alerted by my sudden intake of breath, but whatever it was had melted into the shadows. I was left gripping the wheel, pulse hammering in my ears, replaying the moment. It had moved again, just like before. A silent, calculated shift deeper into the woods. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, not caring about the slick road anymore. All I wanted was distance. He started to ask what I saw. I stumbled through words like, something really big. Might have been a tree. But they sounded ludicrous, even to me. He didn't seem convinced, though he caught onto my panic and urged me to slow down, worried I'd lose control of the car. Instead, I kept pushing forward, wanting to leave that region behind as fast as possible. A couple more miles bled into the night, and finally, the "Welcome to Kentucky" sign shone faintly through the haze. Relief trickled in, though it never fully chased away the dread lodged in my gut. Lights became more common. Small, roadside houses, the occasional gas station, traces of normal life creeping back in. Still, I couldn't forget the way that shape had loomed at the tree line. My eyes flicked to the side mirror now and then, almost expecting to see an impossibly tall figure keeping pace in the distance. We arrived at my family's place, right on the edge of dawn. Porch lamps illuminated a gravel driveway, and a sense of familiarity tried to comfort me. But as I stepped out onto the soggy ground, every rustle of leaves behind the house made me twitch. My relatives came out to greet us, calling out how they'd worried we'd get stuck in the storm. I forced a smile, pretending the only issue was the weather. Deep down, I was still replaying that moment of second sighting on the road, feeling that it had looked right back at me, fully aware. Inside, I slumped into a chair, trying to shake off the unease. My husband hovered close, sensing I wasn't just tired. The warmth of the room, the smell of coffee, and the soft chatter of my family were comforting. Yet, a knot of tension clung to me. Each time a branch tapped against the window, I thought about what might be out there, looming in the dark, waiting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of half-hearted conversation and restless pacing. Nobody else knew about the haunting images stuck in my mind. That night, when everyone turned in, I sat by the window, peeking out at the rows of trees behind my family's home. A small hope flickered. That morning light might erase the fear, but something told me that what I'd encountered wasn't the kind of thing you just leave behind. It stayed with you, like a secret only you and it understood. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope tonight's stories kept you company in the dark. Sleep well, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe. Good night, and see you in the next one.